Hello everyone, today we are taking an in-depth look at the Maverick fights from the Super Nintendo Mega Man X games and ranking them from the easiest to the hardest. You can go ahead and put quotations around easiest because boss fights in Mega Man games aren't just well known for their memorable characters, but also for their raw challenge. Obviously that's why the games allow the player to upgrade their health and weapons to such a point in order to safely get through these fights. The beauty of the Mega Man boss concept is that none of the upgrades or weapons are actually required to get through any of these guys, although their vastly superior power and health often make the player feel like that's their only feasible option in order to win. It's extremely common that a player has to give up and move stage to stage to finally find one Maverick they can beat, then they take their unlocked weapon and move stage to stage again, trying to find the weakness to another boss that they can defeat, and once the second Maverick is defeated, you take that unlocked weapon and the strategy continues from there, moving stage to stage again. Well, today is going to be quite a bit different from that, since I was recently wondering just how hard the fights would get and how they would compare if I faced everybody with base health and just your standard Buster. Instead of relying on powers, rather relying on will and skill alone to make it through the 24 Maverick fights between X, X2, and X3. Important to note, this was not on an emulator with save states, and none of my footage ever is. This was on my console, so every boss encounter was earned by beating a stage, and if a few deaths led to a game over, that of course meant playing through their levels again. No shortcuts, no passwords, no turbo controller, no nonsense, and absolutely no bullshit. Just pure Maverick hunting straight from the soul. Last thing before starting to mention is the criteria. How can we try to stay objective with the list? To me, difficulty here can be pretty much boiled down to just 4 factors. Margin for error, how much does the game really ask of you to stay safe? The severity of punishment, aka the damage you take for mistakes. Window of opportunity to attack, because that's the only way for the fight to end of course. And lastly, the amount of damage actually done by your attack to the enemy. Now that we have some criteria to go on, let's get this list underway. Number 24, Chill Penguin from Mega Man X, which I'm sure may not surprise many of you that have played before. Chill Penguin is a special kind of target because he's the extremely ideal level to start with, since his level contains the only unavoidable and 100% necessary upgrade in the entire series, the dash. The ability comes standard in X2 and X3, not requiring any upgrade for it at all. He has rock-hard projectiles that deflect your shots, he creates little frozen penguin statues that serve as shields defensively, but eventually slides your way with his blizzard wind, which serve as punishment if you weren't aggressive enough with your weapon to blow through them. He's a good boss fight and will test your reaction speed, how quickly you can pound the shot button, and your overall ability to tightly control Mega Man, which is what a lot of these bosses do so well. He also can be tricky to anticipate since the start animations of some of his attacks look identical. His quick belly slide and shooting animations look about the same. Also, when he jumps, he could be coming straight for you, or he might grab the hook on the ceiling, activating his blizzard wind and sending his statues your way. So the whole fight keeps your mind active and in anticipation. Fortunately, his small size makes him easier to avoid than others. His health is standard, where one shot takes 1 peg of damage away, and your full shot takes away 2 pegs. The most danger is coming in contact with him, since that takes away 1/3 of your health, meaning you couldn't even survive that mistake 3 times. His projectile does a little bit of damage, so that's pretty forgiving. As long as you stay on your toes, go to the wall for some safety, and not afraid to keep shooting, you'll be pounding him in no time and having fun doing it. Number 23, Crystal Snail from Mega Man X2. He's the boss I used to always start with when I played Mega Man X2, since he was the first Maverick I felt like I could beat, even though this isn't the recommended order for speed. To me, he's just a defensive fight that requires patience, and the only thing that can cause any damage to you is him. His projectiles that are much harder to avoid merely crystallize Mega Man in place, and it's not anything difficult to mash out of at all. It just has a lot of waiting involved, and to make matters worse, his power that he gains on low health is a slow-mo attack of all things. In general, it's a lot of waiting for him to shoot your way and trying to get a hit or two in before he's back in his impenetrable shell again. It becomes pretty obvious that he's going to shoot your way since the shell rotates pretty slowly before it happens, and you can just bait his direction easily. Then just dash out of the way. You basically just try to dodge the crystallizing goo with shooting, mash out of getting crystallized, move a time or two out of the way of his shell, then you try to shoot and dodge goo again, rinse and repeat, then again in slow motion. He has standard health, taking 1 and 2 pegs of damage, and his only attack is easy to avoid but does pretty heavy damage. The fight moves at a snail's pace, but even still, pretty easy to outlast. Number 22, Storm Eagle from Mega Man X. This might surprise a couple people, but just keep in mind just how stacked this list is. So even the lowest listed of fights are still bound to be met with some difficulty. Besides, keep in mind that Storm Eagle is a boss with a lot of wind attacks that are made incredibly easier to deal with by dashing. It's easy to deal damage to him just dashing toward him and shooting. When he shoots out an egg with the little robot birds, it's somewhat hard to avoid a little, but it doesn't do that much damage anyway. The attack that would do a bit more damage is when he is dive bombing, but this is still really easily avoidable even without the dash by holding down on one direction. That's all you really have to do, plus using the dash makes it easy to get enough space to turn around and shoot him. His health is standard, so you can take 1 or 2 pegs of health. Overall, a great fight and great stage, just truly not that hard if you use your dash and charge shot well. Number 21, Bubble Crab. Bubble Crab from X2. This boss could vary in difficulty for players using the Buster, depending on just one thing: how fast can you pound the shot button? Some people are only able to mash quickly with a specific setup that they use for like Mario Party or something with their index finger, while shooters in gaming moments like this would require the player to be able to use their thumb and still be in control of Mega Man. Bubble Crab has a bubble shield that could stump a lot of players that can't get past this barrier. The only way to break through it is to pump him full of shots as quickly as possible in order to stagger him and keep yourself out of danger. For a handful of these fights, a good offense can create a good defense. It's never been more true than with Bubble Crab. You can keep him away from you over half the time by mashing shots and just need to occasionally move underneath him or get out of the way of his jumps. Or you may need to jump over him, holding the jump and dash button together, B and A from the wall, which can absolutely be tricky for plenty of people since it can feel awkward. There are some crab projectiles that don't do very much damage, and if you just want to avoid coming in contact with him, since that does a lot more damage. His health is standard at 1 and 2 pegs. The fight can feel long because the majority will be 1 peg hits between breaking through his shield, but in general, if you just shoot a lot, it totally stuffs his whole approach to his offense, and it's not that hard. Number 20, Flame Mammoth. Flame Mammoth from X, while his mugshot in the stage select and his stature can look pretty intimidating, Flame Mammoth isn't really that horribly difficult of a fight since it follows a pretty simple pattern to put damage on him. Although there are a few things going on like the conveyor belt, his molten tar that can hold you in place, fireball shots, and his jumps that cause the floor to quake and knock you off balance, he's not actually a super hard boss to avoid as long as you are comfortable using B and A together while on the wall to dash jump over him successfully. His quaking jumps are reminiscent of Gutsman from Mega Man 1, but feel just a bit easier to avoid with a larger margin for error. He doesn't pose that much of a threat right in front of you as long as you're ready to dash away from or underneath and jump. His sticky molten tar isn't very hard to avoid or mash out of if you step in it on accident, and his fireballs just take away 2 pegs of health from Mega Man. It just takes a few tries to get the timing of the jumping. If you stay aggressive with shooting and utilize your charge shots as you avoid his body, you can deliver 2 damage instead of 1. Holding and jumping with charge shots off the wall can definitely be tricky for players since you are already dealing with B and A, now you're throwing Y into the mix with it all, with just 1 thumb of course, but as long as you can time his quaking jump and clear his head when you jump over off the wall, he's not that bad. Number 19, Blizzard Buffalo, is who I would consider the easiest boss for Mega Man X3. The boss room is extra wide and would take advantage of players that aren't comfortable using the dash and jump buttons together, on the ground or on the wall. The boss crashes into the wall over half the time, then you just jump over, turn around and shoot, then you flee away to rinse and repeat. Sometimes he stops and throws ice chunks that can hurt you in the air or after they stick to the ground and walls. Getting rammed by him deals 5 pegs of damage to you, so just barely under 1/3 of your 16 pegs, which matters because you could technically survive 3 hits from his body. The harder thing to avoid are his ice chunks, and they deal just 3 pegs of damage, which is still pretty significant. Fortunately, a large ice blast that he uses just has a freezing effect, so you need to mash out quickly but doesn't deal any damage, and it's pretty easy to mash out or avoid on the wall anyway. As long as you're comfortable jumping over his head while charging your shot to do 2 pegs of damage and dashing away, this fight isn't too bad at all. Number 18, Wire Sponge from X2 is one of my favorite fights from the whole series, and it all stems from how active the fight is, along with how well animated the boss is himself. I just get more of a cartoony Earthworm Jim type of vibe from Wire Sponge, and the reason why this animation is even relevant to our topic is because his animation quickly but fluidly telegraphs his attacks, and although you need to move around quite a bit during the fight to avoid his seeds, plants, jumps, and his whipping plant chain, you get a split second to see them coming. Aside from that, his attacks and projectiles only deal 2 pegs of damage. This makes sense though and feels balanced because of how tricky he can be to avoid overall. Wire Sponge feels like a slightly different dance every single time, and I always love squaring off against him, and the only moment that feels a bit unpredictable is when his health gets low and becomes invincible for a moment to send down a couple strikes of lightning. But even with this bit of unpredictability coming at the end, if you didn't take much damage in the beginning of the fight, you really don't have much to worry about. His health is standard and receives 1 to 2 pegs of damage and deals 2 pegs of damage to you, so the only challenge is taking away 32 pegs of health from him before he deals 16 pegs of damage to you. Number 17, Magna Centipede from X2. It's a boss that can get pretty tricky with his throwing stars, the ability to jump and transfer between the floor and the ceiling, and a move where his sections of his tail surround and try to collapse on Mega Man, and also tries to draw you in with some sort of psychic magnetic force to disable your abilities, such as being able to dash or charge your Buster. You can jump over his stars and other projectile attacks somewhat easily if you react quickly enough with a jump or dash, but they do take 3 pegs of damage. Coming into contact with him while he's jumping, transferring, or teleporting can definitely happen and does a solid 4 pegs of damage. Even if you get a power absorbed and taken from you later in the fight though, which happens, it's not that crazy, and just a matter of finishing him off with shots on the ground or using the wall to reach him on the ceiling. You do have plenty of time in between his teleporting and attacks, so it's not that hard to charge your Buster to do 2 pegs of damage to him as well. Number 16, Neon Tiger from X3. He's a boss that I feel like could have been made a lot more interesting if he moved around quicker between his attacks. His tail can shoot projectiles that come quickly, but they are shot in a predictable order. He can shoot on the ground or on the wall, and he sometimes pounces to swipe or will rush at you with his Wolverine claws, which does a more substantial chunk of damage, as expected. But he's definitely not the fastest of the Maverick Hunters, so overall when you combine his underwhelming speed with his predictable shot patterns, he's not a very hard fight. It's a little challenging that he can deflect shots and maybe catch you off guard with a pounce or rush between the flurries of shots, but avoiding his minor damage shots and his claws is just not that hard. Plus his invincibility rushes towards the end of the fight are clearly telegraphed with the blinking orange, and if you're comfortable dash jumping to the wall and back away from it, you don't need to worry much about taking those big hits and you will outlast him. Number 15, Boomer Kuwanger from X. He's an interesting boss with all sorts of teleporting, dashing, and boomerang abilities. This is another fight where a good offense serves as a good defense, since pumping out shots will help keep him at bay, although he is very stubborn and resilient, and will overtake your space whether you want him to or not. Sometimes you definitely need to use the wall for safety, but if you stay up there for too long, he will punish you by throwing his boomerang, so you need to jump quickly behind and continue to fire. When he teleports around, that's when things can get unpredictable and a little sketch as well, because touching you, it does a solid 4 pegs of health. His boomerang comes quickly, but does just 2 pegs, so that's not too bad. The main threat is his presence, and the developers knew this was meant to be a high-octane, all-offense type of fight, because although your Buster does just 1 peg of health, a full charge shot does 3 pegs of damage to Boomer, so that was their attempt to balance this fight out, since they knew he could be quite dangerous. Number 14, Wheel Gator from X2. It's a fight that can have a lot of moving parts all at once, so much so that the game actually experiences a little bit of slowdown. Ironically, the slowdown actually helps the fight be a little easier since it gives you more time to think about what's all on the screen and coming your way. Wheel Gator is often underneath what I assume is dirty, rusty water, unless there's something a lot more horrific going on here. I mean, it is red after all, but I don't know why. Anyway, while he's down there, you have spike wheels that you need to avoid, and it helps if you're comfortable holding B and A on the wall. You can tell where he's hiding based on where the wheel comes from, which affects the timing of the dodge. Eventually, Wheel Gator pops out, and the idea is to not get caught by his teeth, of course, but it actually doesn't do much damage at all if you mash out, so it's not that dangerous. The difficulty comes from having to concentrate on shooting the boss while he's out of the water, combined with the multiple spinning wheels rolling past you and falling on you too. Plus some projectiles that he shoots while he's temporarily invincible during this part as well. Eventually, he does a spin attack that could do a chunk of damage if you don't avoid it, but it also has an effect on the wall, which becomes sharp and causes damage if you touch it again. So if you don't hurry up and finish the fight, the walls could get covered, which is your only safe area to begin with. Number 13, Drill Rhino from X3. On the surface, it seems to be an overall pretty simple pattern of crashing left or right into the walls, but it has a few important factors that can turn it into a much more difficult fight to complete than you would think. It's a fight that requires being very comfortable using B and A together from the wall and other dash maneuvers to avoid taking a hit. Plus, he punishes any preemptive jumps by screeching to a halt and turning back around very hard with significant damage from getting rammed, or later in the fight where Rhino shoots out 3 delayed drills, and only a perfectly timed A and B wall jump is going to get you as far as you need. If somebody is unable to do this, they would lose the fight every time after just a few hits from this attack. This isn't an overly enjoyable or fun fight either since it's so straightforward, but that's also where the difficulty could arise for a lot of people since it requires well-timed long jumps throughout the whole thing. Getting rammed or hit by the drills just a handful of times is enough to end your life, and he moves fast, but if you can stay disciplined with your timing and jumping thumb, it will give this fight the illusion that it's very easy. Number 12, Overdrive Ostrich from X2. It's one of the cooler and more interesting fights in my opinion. This guy is actually super athletic and will make a fantastic track athlete with his running and jumping abilities. You fight on uneven terrain, making the fight have more variety when he charges you by running or with bounding strides. He also throws his slicer projectile in a line, or often leaps in the air to send slices downward, with a small gap in between them to be safe. The background is also part of the fight too, since running away from Overdrive Ostrich means he will blaze through the background and jump over a mile to confront you again and again. Using the high ground and timing a dash to lower ground is the safest strategy to avoid damage and having space to turn around and shoot. I enjoy that the fight has so many options and that every attack requires a defensive response with properly timed dashes or jumps. Getting hit takes away a quarter of your health, so getting bopped just 4 times ends your life. Fortunately, the little slicer projectiles only take away 2 pegs, although they can definitely be tricky to avoid. It's a busy and fun fight that I enjoy every time I play it. Number 11, Sting Chameleon from Mega Man X. He's definitely a difficult fight and barely outside of the top 10 and could arguably fit up there. Getting this high on the list means you're absolutely nobody to play with. It's a fight that requires you to overcome a lot since he has a strong offense and a stubborn defense. Nothing is for free in this fight at all. His stage is also the only one to feature spikes on the ceiling that result in instant death. He starts the fight every time with a jump above your head to attack by throwing tail spike orbs your way or shaking the room to drop little spikes from the ceiling. Both attacks are tricky to avoid, and they do 2 pegs of damage. Chameleon uses camouflage between his attacks, not only making him nearly invisible, but he's invincible as well. Sometimes he approaches into your space before reappearing to quickly whip his tongue out, taking 4 pegs of damage. The only reason I've been able to make it through this when he does his approach is by manipulating his position. Chameleon will only move so close to Mega Man, but if you're standing next to the wall, he will get way too close and you won't have any safe space. But if you are strategic and move underneath or next to him, it will jam his movement from trapping you, and you'll have a split second to dash away and quickly attack as well. The only opportunities to shoot him are tricky too. You need to use the wall to jump over his tail orbs to shoot while looking up for his next wave of orbs again. You can also shoot him when he's shaking the room, but the falling spikes are usually worth paying attention to avoid, since trading 1 or 2 peg shots with 2 pegs of damage while the boss has double your health is just not a good strategy. It's a fight that requires precision and patience, since your openings are brief to attack and almost always on the top half of the screen. While Chameleon is also attacking, it absolutely requires some practice to get through this battle, since those windows are pretty small. If you've made it this far, thanks so much for watching. Next video will of course be our top 10 hardest Maverick fights of the original Mega Man X trilogy on Super Nintendo. What'd you guys think so far? Any predictions for the next video? I'd love to see what you consider to be your top 10 hardest Maverick fights. Or any predictions for my next video. I can tell you that the next 10 fights are nothing to play with, especially the last 2 fights that required a substantial amount more effort than the rest of these guys, so don't miss out. Thanks so much again for watching, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your day. And I hope to see you next time for the top 10 hardest Maverick fights on the Super Nintendo.